Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you currently reside in the world. Welcome to the webinar titled The Essentials of a CRM Vision. My name is Alexander Niers and I'm with the Lightera marketing team. And before we kick it off, I would like to go through a few housekeeping notes and then I'll hand the proverbial microphone to Kate Kane, the panel host of today. So questions can be asked using the questions tooling to the probably right side of your screen, and we'll try to handle them live on the air. And a recording of the session will be distributed afterwards together with the slides and a short survey, so you could let us know how we did. And we obviously appreciate the feedback. So yeah, Kate, let me hand it over to you to introduce the panel and kick off the session.
Great, thanks, Sander. So greetings from the Midwest and welcome and thanks for making time today. Before we get started, I want to take this opportunity to introduce my co-panelists. There we go. So I'm the Director of Product Management with Lightera Foundation. I've been with the foundation team now since May of 2020, but prior to that, spent about 22 years, give or take, working in large law firms, primarily based in Chicago, and opportunity to travel the world, working on a variety of projects and implementations and teams and so on and so forth. And marketing technology and firm data is a big piece of that experience. But before we jump in, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how it relates to today's topic?
Yeah, except you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Sorry, my donut speaker got stuck. Great start. Other than not being able to use technology, which you'd thought after 20 months I would have cracked by now doing this, my name is Michael Warren. I work at Wilson Allen, where I head up the client development and intake practice. I've been working with firms for just over a quarter of a century now, helping them with defining and hopefully realizing their CRM strategies. So I'm really excited about our recent Lightera Foundation partnership, and really pleased to be on a panel with Kate and Howard today.
Great. Howard?
Sure. I'm Howard Kravitz. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Winston & Strawn, and I'm watching people join the webcast, and I'm thinking, Michael and Kate must be very interesting people, because there can't be that many people interested in hearing what I have to say. So I've been, I've been sort of pounding the table for the legal profession in particular to get better at using data for many years now, and we are a very happy foundation client, a customer. So hopefully I can lend a couple of thoughts on how we're using it, what the vision looks like, and probably most importantly, how do we sell it internally?
Excellent. All right. Well, for today's program, we've actually got it in two parts. Our first part is going to be just about 15 minutes or so, Michael and I sharing with you some market observations and trends that we're seeing across firms, particularly as it relates to CRM and related technologies. And that'll take about 15 minutes or so, but then we'll transition into the most interesting part where we will get to hear from Howard and his experience, as well as Michael, into a more interactive Q&A session. Just to reinforce what Sander mentioned at the beginning, please post questions using the QA tool. And as we go through, we'll try to work those into the discussion, and any that we're not able to get to within our scheduled hour, we'll certainly follow up on. So with that, Michael, let's go ahead and get started.
So, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
So I guess one of the things that has really struck me over the last couple of years is that there's been so much change in the marketplace. So it's not altogether unsurprising that those changes in marketing and business development technology landscape has led to a bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So I thought, Kate, we might start by just having a bit of a discussion about kind of what we're seeing and how firms are addressing that.
So are we seeing, I think we've got three categories here in terms of how, when we initially started the planning process, you described sort of what you're hearing from firms in terms of their thoughts around, do we have the right CRM system?
Yeah, and those three kind of fall into these three camps broadly. There are those who I think have, because of the market volatility, have, and also I guess combined with the pandemic, have made the decision that they're going to kind of kick discussing CRM technology down the road. And I think that's an important distinction, CRM technology. We'll come on to that in a moment. I think there are those that are seeing an opportunity with the changing landscape to kind of seize the moment and possibly and hopefully for them gain some competitive advantage over those firms who perhaps are kind of not, grasping the nettle when it comes to the technology. And there are those who I think kind of maybe have emotionally made the decision that they need to do something, but they would like to see how some dynamics in the market are going to play out whilst they're kind of thinking about it, while they're doing their due diligence, talking to their stakeholders. But I think for me, it doesn't really matter where you are on that risk spectrum. One thing always holds true is you've really got to be clear what it is, the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, and I think that takes us to the next point quite nicely, and actually understanding that, can't underscore it enough, understanding the problem you're trying to solve is really at the very heart of the matter, and at least in my opinion should be driving which of those camps your firm certainly squares up to. But with this in mind, I do want to challenge how we're defining CRM, both for the purposes of this discussion, but also more broadly across the market. When you ask 10 different people what does CRM mean, odds are good you'll get 12 different answers. Some of them a variation on a theme, but probably 12 different answers. So for today's purposes in particular, I'd suggest that if you're asking, do we have the right CRM system, you may not be asking the right question. Establishing an impactful CRM vision, kind of tying back to the title for today, that vision or that strategy requires you to think bigger than just the technology. And to be fair, there's nothing simple about the technology per se, but that's one piece of a bigger puzzle. Thinking beyond the software, aiming higher to shift your focus onto a strategy centered around those relationships. And I think this definition works really well. If you think about client, whether you call it client relationship management, contact relationship management, just relationship management, really focusing that on a strategy centered around nurturing and growing the right relationships. Not every relationship, but the right relationships. And that strategy is, of course, supported by technology and people and process. But at the end of the day, the technology is a tool, one tool among many in that particular toolbox. Ultimately, I think most firms would agree that the real goal is to deliver real value both to the client and to the firm with whatever strategy or vision that the team defines. So, Michael, I know you advise firms thinking about their CRM strategy, thinking about evaluating technologies and processes, but you often center that around the client data lifecycle. I'd like you to walk us through that model and highlight how that relates to our marketing and business development functions.
Sure. So, and I think the data piece is really, really key here. An article by The Economist in 2018, I think it was, predicted that data would become or would overtake oil as the most valuable asset in the world. If you think about, if you're old enough to think about big companies in the 70s and the 80s, the biggest companies around that time were those that provided fuel, literally fuel, to run the world. Whereas now, if you look at the biggest companies in the world, Apple, Google, Netflix, Facebook, Microsoft, they're all purveyors of data. So data has become the new oil, and it is the most valuable commodity that a business can possess. One of the challenges about CRM systems, which is so different to other systems, is that, take your time and billing system, for example, you control the data that exists in that system. It's data that you generate as a firm, it's data that you can control. CRM systems are made up of data that is outside of your control. It's data about other people, about other companies. It's a much more challenging problem to solve. So if you're going to use it effectively, like those big companies I mentioned, data can really transform your business. But for CRM to succeed, it has to address a number of different requirements. So it's no longer enough just to provide information that the user knows and provide that data to them more quickly and easily. I mean, that's useful, of course, but that's a little bit kind of table stakes now. I think what you need to be able to do is provide data that they can't find from somewhere else. And that's what this lifecycle slide is trying to show, that the data that you're trying to get hold of may exist in lots of different formats and even in different places. And that means that if you don't get this right, you can often spend all of your time trying to manipulate and curate the data as opposed to analyzing it and interpreting it.
Right. It's like making that transition from information to insights, right? I mean, I think, when thinking about this in the context of a relationship strategy, it's not unusual, particularly for folks that are in leadership positions within marketing and business development organizations. It's not unusual for folks to focus on the two ends of this particular cycle, right? The marketing and business development end, the referral tracking, and the client feedback ends. And probably because those are the areas that marketing and business development professionals have the most influence over within their own organizations, talking about the stuff that you can control versus the stuff coming from other areas. But if your relationship strategy, if your overall vision for how you're growing and nurturing these relationships is focused only on those two ends of the life cycle, I'd say you're missing a huge opportunity. There's so much meaningful information that comes up at each of these other intervals. Meaningful information about the client's preferences, the client's business model, the things that keep them up at night, what their future needs might be, whether that's during the pricing phase, while you're onboarding that new relationship or onboarding that new piece of work, and certainly during the delivery of services. So there's really a goldmine of information available there. And I think the firms that have the most successful relationship strategies that are sustainable over time recognize those opportunities along the entire cycle and make sure that they're collecting that information, but perhaps more importantly, that they're making that information readily available and leveraging it to answer the kinds of questions that you see here on the screen throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, CRM, if nothing else, its job is to join the dots between different systems and to make connections that the user wasn't aware of before. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the technology there. And technology is going to play a more important part because we're so busy. Data has to be captured and integrated and interpreted automatically. But it also has to be provided in context, and you kind of touched on a few examples there. That it's got to be readily available and instantly understandable. I mean, and although kind of when you describe this to people and you have this discussion with firms, and they kind of say, well, that sounds a bit like nirvana. Again, I have to break the news to them. And actually, well, I mean, there's a real kicker in this, which is, as firms transition in terms of their leadership and the demographics of firms are changing. From an age profile and a diversity profile, people are coming into firms who expect this to be available instantly. They want to have information, using technology, which is as easy to understand as an iPhone app, and it has to work and it has to work fast. So, we're going to a world of people's personal productivity and their narrow focus. And I think, we were talking before we started the session today, that almost every engagement you have with a person is a meeting as opposed to an encounter. So we've become kind of very narrow focused in perhaps the way that we work, and that's a real challenge for firms to kind of get that institutional view of data. How do I leverage the intelligence, the expertise, the experience that my individual lawyers have, and how do I institutionalize that? And I think that requires you to take that step back and start thinking about how data evolves and flows over time.
Yeah, and I think, to provide a real life example, wanted to break down one of those questions that we had flagged on the life cycle. And so while we were planning today's program, Michael shared this particular slide with us, which I thought was a really terrific example of how to use data to inform marketing efforts. When I first began working really closely with marketing professionals at different firms, the name of the game was get the invitation to as many bodies as you possibly can. The more, the many, so that you can get the right number of people in. And I think that the days of blast to everyone under the sun and hope the right ones show up really are coming to an end if they haven't already. And making sure that you've got not just a volume of folks, but the right folks. Are the right eyes seeing your publication? Are the right ears hearing your podcasts or your webinars and so on? And I think, being able to be smart about how you're engaging with those clients and customers and contacts is a really critical part of that overall CRM vision.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking, when we were prepping for this session and we were talking about this slide, that my first job in marketing was stuffing envelopes and licking stamps, and there was a discipline in terms of marketing targeting that existed then, because you had to make sure that you ordered the right number of stamps and envelopes, and you had to print the right number of brochures. So you had to have a discussion about who are we sending this to. Whereas I think with email, I think that kind of thought process, initially certainly, kind of got lost a little bit. And I think that's because, to start with, firms thought about data in a very particular way. Data has to be structured. It's got to be drop-down lists. It's got to be folders. It's got to be fields. So naturally, when you're building a marketing list, it's done entirely with saved searches and structured data. But the problem with that is that lawyers don't often have the time to provide information in a structured way. So what's the result? People don't get on marketing lists, or worse, they get on the wrong lists. So we have to change our thinking in terms of that. So what I would say is we need to consider, and that's what this slide is really trying to illustrate, is, does the data we need to identify who goes on a list, does it already exist somewhere else in the firm? The other paradigm shift is that the advances in technology, such as indexed searching or machine learning, are now allowing us to start adding structure to unstructured data. So full text searching, suggested tagging, those sorts of things. So if you think again about some of the companies I talked about earlier on, Netflix, Amazon, and so on, and that whole concept of people who bought this also bought this, that kind of technology is now starting to find its way into law firms, probably initially in contract review and automating those sorts of operational tasks, but increasingly it's starting to find its way into marketing. And that's enabling us to do things like find me all the people we talked to about X in the last 6 months, and then actually go a step further than that and add them to the following marketing lists, because that list is focused on people who are interested in X. So kind of peeling back the onion a little bit and thinking about the criteria that make up who goes on a list. So our status relationship with them, are they a client or not? The subject matter, jurisdictionally, geographically, where are they located? Just kind of thinking about those different variables might start helping us to think how we break down the data and how we work out where it's going to come from.
Yeah, and I can't help but notice that at least some of these things aren't what might be considered core contact management or traditional contact management from your original CRM systems, being able to tie in the kinds of work that folks are involved in and so on. So in terms of getting back to the question that we started with, do we have the right CRM, or based on my challenge, do we have the right CRM strategy? What are the 4 factors, really quickly before we transition into our discussion, what are those 4 factors that firms should take into account when answering that question, Michael?
So I think the first one is around data-driven decision-making. When I speak to firms, increasingly, it's not just about knowing who we know, but it's about knowing what we know and what we can do to leverage that. I think firm leadership are much more involved and have a greater understanding about the value of this data. It's the data that fuels the engine room of the firm, if you like. So thinking about experience systems, I speak to firms now when they're talking about this experience data drives how we recruit, our diversity and inclusion strategy. It drives our work allocation strategy. So that data drives the decisions that they need to make. So naturally, that's leading on to the second, which is demand for analysis and insights, not just data and information. So it's got to be about outputs, not just inputs, and being really clear what are the questions that you're trying to answer, and broadening the pool of data that you're pulling information from in order that you can answer those questions. Technology we've talked about. So another one I would just kind of raise quickly is Power BI, the ability to visualize information to help you answer questions like, what are we good at? what are the right sources of business, and to be able to do that quickly and easily without having to create huge data warehouses. And both of those are because we need to get more sophisticated about business development. You know, most firms say pretty much the same things on their websites as each other. So differentiating yourself is really about, you know, who we know, how, you know, what we do, and to be able to understand that, you need access to the precedent, the client intelligence, and the relationship intelligence. So finally, kind of bringing it back to clients, and this is kind of the part of your original kind of question, was, you know, this is not just about a technology strategy, it's about a client strategy and an overall strategy. More often than not, the best source of new client work is from your existing clients. So understanding the value that your clients are deriving from what you're delivering to them, and being able to measure that in a coordinated way by pulling the right information together in order to develop those relationships further is really the key that we're seeing in you know, firms who are grasping that kind of the CRM challenge, if you like.
Definitely.
So I guess all this leads me back to the original question that you posed, Kate, and is CRM really the right term? In my view, no, it's not. The thing that we've always missed in the past is that it's about business management, not just about managing client relationships. It's firm-wide, it's not siloed. It's dynamic, it's not static. It's you know, it's output focused, it's not input focused. So if we can shift our thinking in that direction, then we're much more likely to succeed. One final thought is, it's certainly true that you can have successful projects that focus on people and process without necessarily considering data and technology, but the converse is absolutely not true, is that you need to work out how people are going to interact with the systems, what are the decisions that they need to make, and that's the only way, in my opinion, that firms can create the right strategy.
You know, that last part is so important, it bears repeating. You know, we could probably both point to, all three of us could probably point to plenty of successful initiatives that were driven by, you know, primarily focused around people and process. You know, sometimes technology and data were involved, perhaps sometimes not. However, at least I cannot think of a single example of a technology or data project that was exclusively technology or data, you know, to the exclusion of the other two pieces that was successful. Really, to have a technology or a data project, you've got to have all four pieces of this particular puzzle for that to take the, to really have that value or deliver that value or deliver that impact that firms are looking for. Excellent. Well, hopefully that gives everyone a little bit of context around what's happening in the market, some things to think about as you're considering your own strategies. So at this point, what I'd like to do actually is to pivot a bit. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that now you can hopefully see the three of us. Sander, if we can, let's switch to the audience view so they can see just the presenters. I'll leave that to you to figure out if there's a button we can click there. And if not, I can go back to sharing my screen, I suppose. Maybe I'll move our faces over there. But the idea here is I'd like to bring Howard back into the conversation and, you know, talk through some discussion questions. I definitely encourage, all right, if we're going to continue to see that, I am going to at least put something more interesting up on the screen. All right, so, you know, would like to actually start with you, Howard. You know, Michael described three distinct camps when it comes to firms evaluating their current technology environments, their current CRM technologies. You know, stick with the status quo, rip it out and start over, and wait and see. You know, in terms of where Winston is today, what are you hearing from your peers? And if you're willing to share, what your thoughts and feelings are on that particular front?
Sure, thanks for asking. And I think a few of us are dying to know if that's actually Cruella de Vil behind you on a picture back there. So you don't really need to comment on that, but we're sort of wondering. So I will answer the question. I want to tell a little story first, very quickly. So short story. So anybody who's looked me up knows I've worked in a couple of different places, a professional services firm, other law firms. And I came from a professional services firm that was really, I thought, using data and analytics and technology very well, was at the forefront of what many companies do and helping many of the companies that Michael had spoke about earlier. And I walked into a law firm and I spoke to a law firm leader, and I made the mistake of using the word CRM. So I'm actually going to be a little radical here and say we should stop. It's one thing to talk to each other about it, but I said, we need to work on our CRM system strategy, whatever I said. And the managing partner of this particular firm said, "What's CRM?" And I said, "Well, stands for client relationship management." And this leader said, "Isn't that what partners do?" And I realized right then and there that I would never speak to another law firm leader and use the initials CRM. And I decided then and there to talk about data, analytics, technology, and revenue, making money. And that's really aligned to Michael's comments around business strategy and basically how do we use information, data, and technology to drive revenue of the firm. That gets people's attention. So what have we done at Winston? So I would add a fourth category, perhaps, if you will, to the three. They're wonderful, and it's a great articulation of what most people are going through. I think there's a concurrent. So at Winston, what we really did is we worked concurrently. We said we can't just stop delivering to the partners and the lawyers and others in the firm various insights that the data and the tools that we had provided, and we needed to migrate to something better. So you can't just stop, or at least that was what we felt, right? We couldn't just stop and say, wait however many months until we build this new tool to help you, or new tools to help you have more information. But we need to migrate in that direction. So here's what we will do. Here's where we're going. So I think that's a little bit of a fourth category. Wait and see is not okay. I would just argue with anyone that the idea of people waiting to see where this all shakes out, man, if you're waiting, you're falling really far behind, right? We're behind as an industry. I think many of our firms are probably behind what some of those companies that Michael alluded to are. And I think aligning the experience with what lawyers and partners have in their personal lives it has worked very well for me. So saying to someone, for example, if you're a Kindle reader and you go on Amazon and you finish the book and they give you the next 5 recommendations, it's pretty good, right? Based on your library, on your purchase history, they get tighter and tighter and tighter. And frankly, I get a lot of my Kindle books by Amazon recommendations. That's how I don't go to Barnes & Noble anymore. I don't go to bookstores anymore. So that is a way to search. So if that's an experience, and I'll wrap up in a second, if that's an experience that consumers, individuals are having, I know we talk a lot about B2B and B2C. I like the expression B to I, it's business to individual. And if that's an experience that an individual is having, then I think a successful law firm wants to provide a similar experience from a marketing and business development perspective. And both you, Kate, and Michael have touched on this, is giving people better information to provide better analytics to hopefully provide people with the things that are more interesting to them.
Yeah.
I'll say one last thing quickly here is I interview a lot of clients, and one thing clients tell me all the time is I get hundreds of these. If it's an email campaign or invitation or a piece of thought leadership, they kind of smile and they go, I get hundreds of these. And it's really hard to discern which ones to look at.
Sure, and I'm going to attempt I've confirmed with the team that they can see us now, not the Latera background. So thank you, Howard. Now I want to riff off of two things that you said really quickly. The comment from the feedback interview. I too remember sitting in a debriefing from a large client feedback interview process, and some of the feedback from one of the particular folks at that particular client said, "I never hear from you," and the partner immediately snapped with, "Well, but we've sent them 386 of these publications, and we've invited and it's like, all right, but let's think about that. They never hear from you. They get stuff, but is that the same as hearing from you? So really sort of thinking about that, and I think that plays into the comment, the idea of, it's business to individual, and that individual, that kind of person to person, the partner to the GC, the partner to the head of acquisitions, the partner to the head of the equity group, whoever, whatever that connection is at the lifeblood, that's at the heart of, legal marketing and relationship development and such. And I think that's where a lot of technologies that come from the outside, that were born and bred in other industries that look at legal as a target-rich environment in terms of technology, get it wrong, right? They're focused on maybe accounts or those other kinds of things that make perfect sense in other parts of the world, but don't quite translate when we're talking about the business to individual kinds of relationships that drive legal marketing. Great. Michael, I want to ask you, we talked about thinking about the bigger CRM vision and shifting that discussion from software to strategy, right? As you're working with leaders at different firms, interested, are you seeing signs of this shift, or are our marketing technology leaders in particular still holding on to those old definitions? How is that transition going for those folks?
I'm definitely seeing changes, and I'm going to share an anecdote as well, but I want to pick up on a couple of things that Howard said. One was around the involvement of the discussion with the business leaders, and the second piece was about personalization. I think those are really, really, really important points. And the anecdote I was going to share with you was that I recently did some work for a Canadian firm who were looking to engage us to help them with their CRM strategy, and we were trying to organize a workshop with their CRM project board, and we just couldn't align diaries for me to be in Toronto. I was doing a trip around the States and around Canada, and I just couldn't get in Toronto at the right time. So I kind of rather cheekily suggested that they could come to New York, which is where I was at that moment in time. And because they had an office, they agreed that was fine. What I didn't realize is that the CRM project board had the managing partner and 3 other partners on it. So I had just said to a client I was pitching to, hey, senior leadership, you all get on a plane and come and spend the day with me, as opposed to the other way around. And it was a really good meeting. And at the end of the session, the managing partner said to me, what are our chances of success here? And my reply was, the fact that 4 partners were in the room talking about how to engage and drive change probably just doubled them. And I'm probably understating that. So the moral of the story, and it isn't just that Canadians are extremely accommodating and nice people, we all know that. It's just that, firm leadership are starting to see the connection between the challenges that they have in running their firms and having the right data to be able to do that. I talked about succession planning and recruitment and so on earlier on. They've also recognized that they've undervalued CRM as a contributor to that that data story, if you like. And I think that change is only going to develop further.
Yeah, Howard, although our tenures did not overlap at Winston, I have had the pleasure of working with a lot of folks on your marketing team, and in particular your marketing technology team, both back in my days there, but also with their work on Foundation and so on. And they've clearly made the shift, right, to thinking more strategically about how to bring data together, how to combine things from different places, both internal and external. That didn't happen overnight. So can you tell us a little bit about that journey that your team's been on to make that shift within the Winston marketing organization?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for commenting about the team. I think I have a great team. So, if any of them happen to be listening, I applaud.
Huge fan.
Yeah, they're wonderful people. And I think I think that some of the success that the team has is based on, essentially, we remove the shackles, that it's saying to a group of people that the things that you think about and that you want to do with data are really important, and you have permission to think about it differently. We need it, we want it. It is a way to make a greater impact with the stakeholders of the firm. Just giving people, essentially, I said already, but giving them permission to be thoughtful. I think that using data effectively, it's a little bit like pulling on a ball of string. You uncover one thing and then you realize, oh, that means 2 other things or 3 other things. You just keep, this journey never ends. There's no, that's it. That's all the data we ever needed. we're ready. We can move forward, right?
Well done.
You know, it's always there's another piece or there's new information that's available. You know, Michael talked about it earlier. You know, perhaps we get our internal stuff squared away, and you realize there's external data that we may want to use as well. And you know, there's financial data, and there's data from the human resource system, which lawyers are working on, which matters, and you know, it never ends. So to help the team on that journey, a lot of this is giving them permission to take that journey, and also telling them that it's a worthwhile journey, and supporting them, and you know, standing up for them, and helping them, and learning how to use words that matter to the leaders of the firm. So you know, in this case, I think that I'm really fortunate to work with a group of people who have made that transition and recognize that they can have a more significant impact on the firm by providing better analysis and information to the lawyers who ultimately foster those relationships, get hired to do the work, and perform in a stellar fashion, which I'm sure a lot of law firms think, you know, they have the best lawyers in the world who do amazing work, right? So
Sure.
anyway, you know, that's,
yeah, no, I
love
that phrase that you use, that permission to think about it differently, right? That can be really challenging. You know, you've got the holiday card that must go out. I've been lobbying for Arbor Day cards for years, just because that kind of takes the pressure off, but I've not been successful. But you know, permission to think about that differently is such an important part of the puzzle, and sort of encouraging that creativity. You know, Michael, you know, thinking about the journey that Howard's described with his team, and comparing that to what you've seen at the firms that you've worked with, or firms that you've heard about, you know, what can you share with us about perhaps the lessons learned? You know, where the breakdowns along that road, or the stumbles, and the potholes. What can we learn from what you've seen across the market in that regard?
Just before I answer that question, I wanted to circle back on just kind of listening to Howard there. What's really interesting to me is that when I first started working with firms, there was a gulf between CRM managers and CMOs. They spoke different languages. One person was in the trenches, the other person was kind of in the clouds, if you like. And one of the challenges was how to bridge the gap between them. And I just think I was just kind of really, you know, a bit inspired by listening to Howard talk about the way that you empowered your team, because the people in the trenches are the experts. They know that system, they know what they're trying to do, but they've never previously been empowered to take control of that. And I think that if anything is a really, really important lesson that I'm taking away from that, is that all of us, our jobs in different ways is to empower those people, those experts, to think about data differently. And that's been one of the things that I found really challenging is, you know, I don't think there is a specific singular strategy, although I think what Howard was just talking about comes pretty close. If I had to distill it into kind of simpler terms, I think it's understanding that this is a change management project, and that the most important thing is that there's going to be a need for significant education of people, of our stakeholders, and a key way to achieve that is getting better at explaining the direct correlation between providing data and receiving benefit from having provided that kind of data in the past. Right, so the struggle that we all have is getting our professionals to provide that information. But ultimately, it doesn't necessarily need to be technically that complicated, right? We just need to have the ability to, you know, say to people, you know, in the same place, add an action here, and then receive a reward for having previously provided that action in the past. So you added a note from a meeting that you had with a client. Here's a client that you might want to think about calling today because they've got similar characteristics to the one that you just entered. The problem is that happens in different places very often. And so the connection in the professional's mind between providing information and receiving the benefit from that information is broken. So an analogy that I'll use, which might sound disrespectful, but it was the best one that I could come up with, is you don't give a dog a treat for doing a trick the day after they did the trick, right? Because the connection between the two things is completely broken, right? So if we ultimately want to be able to get people to give us information, we have to be able to give them the reward for that behavior instantly. And the great news is that the technology has moved on. So I guess my answer to your question is, and Howard said it, have permission to think differently about data. The technology has really, really moved on, and there are different ways of doing things, and I find that super exciting. Although, you know, as I'm getting on in age a bit, I find it a bit challenging to get my brain around how some of this stuff works. But yeah, I mean, that's probably how I would. The key strategy, I think, is pretty much what Howard was saying.
Yeah, I mean,
if I may add one more
yeah.
comment. So I think as we have people of different levels and role responsibilities with us today, and I would just say that as a leader, you know, part of our responsibility is to help develop the words, the messaging around the value proposition of changing, as Michael said, the change management. Recognize, so when I think of change management, to me, it's a fairly classic bell curve. 20% of the people, and I'll go to the right, okay? So 20% of the people on the right, they sort of look at you and go like, why haven't you done this already? You know, 20% on the left go like, why do we need this? This is, you know, I don't want to work this way. This is too newfangled for me, you know. And the 60% of the middle is where we make our money. If we can move some of them to the right, you know, that's the way I look at a line, you know, that's where we probably make our money. And the challenge is, how do we speak to them? We don't have to worry about how to talk to the people on the far right, the 20%, because they understand what we say, and they want what we have, they want it yesterday. The people at the end on the left that are never come along for the ride, that's where most of us in the legal profession kind of get weighed down, because they're generally partners who have, you know, they've been with the firm for a while, they make a lot of money, they have a lot of great relationships, they have a very loud voice inside the firm. And so if a few of them complain or, you know, say we don't need to do this, or it's crazy to spend the money on this, whatever, like, we can get dragged backwards when we're trying to move, you know, we get dragged to the left when we're trying to move to the right. And so I think as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to help these wonderfully analytic and creative people think about, how do we talk about what they're doing? What's the messaging to executive management? I mean, I'm fortunate, I sit on the executive committee of the firm. You know, how do we talk to other leaders? And how do we stop talking about CRM and start talking about making money? And, you know, people, that's what they care about, right? So if any one of us can talk about how do we use data, analytics, and technology to drive revenue for the firm, hold on to relationships, cross-sell, make more money, we'll get their attention. If we try to talk about, oh, you know, you need CRM and you got to do this input and that, oh, forget it, we're dead. You know, anyway, my 2 cents.
I completely agree with that. And I think also that, you know, speaking about the 20% on the far left, you know, who aren't going to come along for the journey and often, as you say, weigh down projects, there are other factors that are going to start influencing them. As they start to come towards retirement, the firm leadership is going to start thinking, how do we hand off their clients? It's not a question of lifting them and giving them to somebody else. It's so much more nuanced than that. You know, associates coming to firms, they just don't inherit practices anymore. They have to go out and they have to build relationships with the lawyers. And I think firm leadership are seeing expertise and experience and relationships as dimensions of their human capital, and realize that they need to do more to leverage that. So you're absolutely right, Howard. We don't need to worry to convert these people to use the CRM system, because there are other things going on in the firm that I think will start to play on those individuals.
Yeah, right. They can get left behind on their own. I'm sorry, Kate.
Yeah, no, and I think that's key. I think a couple of things, you know, developing that language, being able to tailor how you're talking about whatever the initiative is or whatever the strategy is to the right audience. The way that Howard might explain it to Fitz and others on the executive committee is quite different from the way you might explain it in a room full of associates or a room full of junior partners or a room full of administrative assistants. Knowing your audience and using that right language is so key. And I think, you know, the extension of that language, and you know, to go back to the analogy, and I think the dog and the treat analogy is kind of perfect. You know, but I think it's so true. I mean, I remember every large law firm I've worked at, the answer to "we need this piece of information" was always put it on the new business intake form. It's like, No, because one, you don't always know that piece of information, and there's such a disconnect between I'm answering these questions that feel pretty random on this really big form when all I want to do is bill my client, and the actual payoff. A colleague of mine in the knowledge management space and I would often joke, if that's the solution, then everything is an acquisition in the admiralty practice focused on agriculture, because those are the first 3 things on each of those pick lists, regardless of sort of what the content is. So really being thoughtful about picking and choosing your spots, but using that right language and connecting to the value. Michael, I want to come back to you in terms of developing this more strategic vision, this more strategic approach around building relationships. And we've talked already a little bit about the technology and how that plays a part in revitalizing and supporting client relationships. What are the potential roadblocks that you've seen that are getting in firms' way as they're trying to make that move or make that a part of their strategy?
I think the biggest roadblock is not being open to what's possible and changing the way that you think about it, because technology is going to play a huge part. I've always said throughout my whole career that the technology doesn't really matter, but actually, you know what? That's not true anymore. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't succeed with some older technology. Everything doesn't have to be all the bells and whistles. But if you think about it, we're all obsessed by our smartphones and instant results. Applications that require no training, and within a minute we know how to work. We know what to do with them. We need to think about how do we solve that for a professional services firm. But I think that's going to be a really, really big challenge. I think two additional things fundamentally. You need to look at how technology can address certain specific issues. So one of the things that I've talked about today is around kind of machine learning and enterprise search, which enables us to surface content in a way that's not been possible before, because that data often lives in 50 different places. So I was working with a firm where they've actually embedded their enterprise search directly within CRM. So when you search for Bank of America or Barclays Bank, you're not just getting the results back from that system, but you're getting results back from different systems, and it learns intelligently the kind of searches that you typically do, and it starts to work out what kind of person you are. So are you a BD person or a partner? So what that means to me is that you don't necessarily have to integrate every single piece of information within every other system. You can access it from different places. And I think the other thing that I talked about earlier on was Power BI. So enabling us to visualize data so much more quickly, so you can really get to under the skin of the problems that you're trying to solve. I guess what I'd leave you with in relation to technology is thinking about don't succumb to the temptation of doing too much. I like to think about personas, a day in the life. So a BD manager, a partner, a CRM manager, and then I like to think about what are the triggers that happen in their world that causes them to want to do something. So for example, if an important contact moves from one client to another, or a partner leaves the firm, those are things that each one of those people are interested in, but their action will be fundamentally different. The CRM manager will want to clean up the system, the partner will want to pick up the phone. So there's no point in giving the partner the same report that you give the CRM manager, right? You need to give them very different things. And I think that's the way I like to, that's how I would overcome some of those roadblocks, is going right back to the basics of what does this person need to do and what information do they need to help them to do it. And once you've worked that out, I think you're much more likely to be successful.
Yeah, I think that actually, the idea of knowing your audience and getting the right information to the right people plays directly into a question that we got from one of our audience members. And forgive me while I scroll up to make sure I get it right. So Howard, I want to toss this one to you first. Amanda asks, has anyone seen success in leveraging different demographics of legal professionals acting as influencers within the firm? For example, junior lawyers helping more senior lawyers thread the needle, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of the, thinking about your bell curve and the different audiences that you've talked about, any sort of hidden gems there in terms of how different cohorts within the organization have been able to help further the strategy or help further the emphasis on data?
I have an answer, and I'm also contemplating how much information to share, right? So that's why
Yeah,
there
yeah.
was a pause for a second. So
Fair enough.
the answer is yes, there's success in looking at what different cohorts bring to the table. There's no question about that people have different relationships, different experiences, different demographic backgrounds, different diversity profiles. The list goes on and on and on. And again, it's really a question of how do we take that data, use it, or massage it, and then who do we give it back to? Do we give it back to the individual who might have the influence and go to them and say, based on our analysis, we think you can do X and you ought to talk to this person? Or do we go to the partner or the other person and do it the other way, right? We've done some analysis and we think this individual who is in the firm or outside the firm, whatever, has some influence on your ability to win such and such business. Both ways work, and I don't think it's very different than and it drives me crazy, and my team knows this, we get these emails, these blast emails that come out every day, pardon the interruption, request for information, right, which is one lawyer going to the entire firm and asking, does anybody know? Does anybody have the experience with? Has anybody worked with, right? And I think that, if we can get in front of that a little bit, then there's opportunity to use some of that information. So generally speaking, that lawyer is looking, maybe it's not precisely what we do as a firm. So it might be, like my neighbor got bit by a dog and I need a personal injury attorney, and it's really not what like a big law firm kind of does. But maybe we should know that neighbor has a relationship with this individual, and maybe that neighbor is the assistant to the president of XYZ company, and perhaps the neighbor, the lawyer should talk to their neighbor about an introduction to the GC at that company. I'm stretching the story a little bit, but we get the point. So short answer is yes. Slightly longer is how do we massage the data and who do we go to with it? And I think it's also uncharted waters. So I think there's opportunity there that most of us are not capitalizing on.
I think it's so easy for marketing technology folks, especially to focus on the partners part demographic within the firm, right? Those are your current rainmakers. Those are the folks that you center your business development strategies around. But I recall being part of my previous firm, mid associate professional development opportunities, or early partner workshops. And it's like, oh, wait, no, I don't need to worry about developing relationships until I make partner. And that's, if you're waiting until then, so much has happened since then. The junior folks in the legal department that are the ones that are interacting directly with the junior folks on the law firm team are, the next GCs. They're the next leaders. And similarly to the associates becoming the next one. So it's never too soon to start thinking about those relationships and thinking about how to manage that information. And I know I had the opportunity to literally travel the world with my previous firm to introduce CRM and how we're collecting contacts and all of that kind of good stuff. And would often be asked, well, should I share my personal contacts? It's like, well, we want business contacts. I don't necessarily want, your Aunt Sue and the dog walker and the soccer coach, unless Aunt Sue, the dog walker and the soccer coach manage a $4 billion hedge fund and have connections to, so really thinking creatively about where are those business relationships, and how to leverage those sort of degrees of separation, if you will.
I have a very quick anecdote.
Yes, please.
So last year, the head of, we have two primary departments in the firm, corporate and litigation, or transactions and disputes, depending upon the day. The heads of both of those departments asked me to review the partner candidates because to look at how they talked about their business development abilities. Mm-hmm. So, I wasn't involved with choosing who the partners were, but I was able to give some feedback to the leaders on, my assessment of those associates' ability to bring in revenue for the firm.
Right. And those relationship angles, thinking of anecdotes, are not just in terms of who you know outside of the firm, but who you know within the firm. I recall actually from my Winston days, literally walking into a conference room in the Paris office. I loved that Winston had a Paris office. In the Paris office to meet with the litigation practice, and not minutes before walking into that room, an associate in the Chicago office sent an all-firm, pardon the interruption, email asking if anyone knew a French-speaking litigator based in Paris that could help a client with a specific issue. And it was just like, wow, okay, so much opportunity. But really thinking about being able to capture that information. So one last quick question, and then we'll go to our finale. Howard, time, resources, technology, all of those things, they don't come cheap necessarily, or they certainly don't come free very often. Could you share with us a little bit about advice that you would offer to your peers who are looking at having to kind of climb that budgetary approval hill? What can we encourage them with?
I'll be short and sweet here. I know we're running out of time. Talk in the language that the top executives of the firm understand. I've shared some of these comments a little bit earlier. If you go in and you say, we need a new CRM system, you may face resistance that you can't understand or comprehend. And if you walk in and say, I have an idea about how we can make more money, then you have a much greater chance of success. So a lot of this is messaging and value propositions, and hopefully that's what, as you move on up in your career and your time and all that stuff, thinking about how to sell to the executive suite, simple, speak in the language they understand, and you'll be much more successful. The idea of talking about CRM, you probably won't have as much success as talking about making more money.
Right. So avoid acronyms, avoid techno speak, avoid talking specifically about software, talk about the impact and the business value, and making sure your language resonates. Great.
Well said. Oh, and making life easier for partners and lawyers, right? So those two things, making more money and making it easier to make that money, they generally are well received. We don't always get the budget, but they're usually well received.
Less resistance, at least.
Right out of the first 5 minutes, if you start with that.
Yeah. So as our grand finale, I want to ask both of our panelists, well, first, thank everyone for attending, but also thank our panelists for contributing to today's program. The last question I want to ask you both, so that we can leave our audience with a bit of advice. Looking back on everything you've learned over the course of your careers and dealing with this kind of particular journey and strategy setting and such, what advice would you like to offer your former self? Things that you wish you knew then that you only know now. What's the one piece of advice that you would offer to the rest of the world to benefit from that? Howard, go ahead.
Find an internal sponsor faster. So if I had to go back and look at myself in years past, I would say, go find partners and people of influence who can support your case, and get their feedback and their input, and maybe they even, I call them body punches, but they might go and lay the groundwork for you. But too often in the past, I thought, well, I know this, I'm smart. Why doesn't anybody listen to me? You got to find influencers and sponsors. That's my advice. Find sponsors sooner. Michael?
Yeah, so I think my lesson is not necessarily that you should treat lawyers like dogs, although weirdly enough we've talked about that a lot today, dog walkers and so on. A lesson to myself is don't overcomplicate it. Is that actually, although all the technology has changed and what's possible has changed, actually going back to my envelope stuffing days, fundamentally nothing has changed, which is, there are only so many things you can do with clients. You can go and visit them, you can phone them up, you can write to them, and that has not changed in hundreds and hundreds of years. So if you don't overcomplicate things, I think that's one thing, and leveraging what Howard said about kind of walk in their shoes, work out how to make their lives easier for them. And I think those two things actually go together. So I guess that's probably what I would tell myself. So
use the right language, find an advocate and an ally, and keep it simple. Excellent. Well, words to live by. We are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Howard and Michael, both for participating in the planning process, but certainly for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who joined in the session. Watch for the materials to be circulated following today. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.